In March 1926, Billy Fullerton was getting married. He was 21 years old, the leader of the Billy Boys, and commander of over 800 Protestant gang members who controlled Bridgeton in Glasgow's East End. His wedding should have been a celebration. Instead, the Norman Conks launched a bottle attack, hurling glass through the windows at his guests in the most humiliating insult in Glasgow gang history. This single act of disrespect ignited a sectarian war that would rage for 2 decades, turning Glasgow into Britain's most violent city, where open razors became the weapon of choice and territorial boundaries were drawn in blood. Between the 1920s and 1930s, Glasgow earned a reputation that city leaders desperately wanted to forget, summed up in 3 words: no mean city. Gangs like the Bridgeton Billy Boys, the Norman Conks, the Beehive Boys, the Calton Tongs, and dozens of others carved the city into territories where crossing an invisible line meant having your face slashed open with a cutthroat razor, creating the infamous Glasgow Smile. Welcome to Clyde, Crooks, where forgotten gang wars and underworld histories get dragged back into the light. If you want more stories of real gangs, real blood, and real consequences, subscribe and ring the bell. New episodes drop 4 times a week. The tradition of gang formation in Glasgow stretched back at least to the 1880s with the penny mobs, who gained their name from the practice of gang members contributing a penny to help pay each other's fines. The courts caught on to the penny a head practice and ended it by jailing rather than fining convicted gang members. The penny mobs mutated into territorial gangs, some quite organized, while others were much looser associations. Men, mostly young in their late teens and 20s, formed gangs in the latter years of the 19th century, based on their territory and sometimes their religion. This was not a phenomenon confined to Glasgow, but Glasgow had more of them, perhaps 6 times as many as London, and they were seen as particularly nasty. The second city had grown so fast and become so prosperous that in the first decade of the 20th century, street-fighting gangs were not in great evidence, or at least were not seen to be too much of a problem. But gang activity became more prevalent after World War I, especially in the first economic slump around 1920 to 1921. It must be noted that at first these were not criminal gangs out to rob and steal, but a form of self-protection based on the pervasive feeling, especially in poorer areas, that if you were not in a gang, you might be singled out for assault. Their ethos moved from self-protection to outright local warfare, and by the mid-1920s, the weapon of choice had become the open razor, the kind which nowadays is usually found only in a traditional barber's shop. The main aim of a gang member was to slash the face of an opponent, inflicting the infamous Glasgow Smile. The era of the razor gangs had dawned. Religious sectarianism had been rife in Scotland for centuries, but the centre of it all was in Glasgow. Originally, Glasgow had been mainly Protestant, but in the 19th and 20th centuries, large numbers of Roman Catholic Irish immigrants came to the west coast of Scotland, drawn by jobs in the local industries. Protestants became irritated at the increasing unemployment rate and blamed the influx of Catholics. Between November 1930 and May 1935, Glasgow's unemployment rate was between 25 and 33%. While it would be misleading to claim that mass unemployment was the sole cause of gang conflicts in interwar Glasgow, the advent of mass unemployment does appear to have led to 2 significant new patterns in gang formation. First, as unemployment peaked locally in the early 1930s and long-term unemployment posed increasing concern, it became more common for young men in their 20s and even 30s to remain active members of street gangs, some of which appear to have provided an important focus for jobless men. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, most of Glasgow's street gangs were territorially based in working-class districts. This was reflected in the choice of names such as the Bridgeton Billy Boys, the Calton Entry, and the Southside Stickers. The Beehive Boys took their name from a draper's shop situated at the corner of Thistle Street and Cumberland Street in the Gorbals. Many gangs were active in the city, but two of the most infamous were the former penny mobs, the Bridgeton Billy Boys and the Norman Conks. The former was Catholic, and the latter avowedly Protestant. Other gangs were very much based on territory, such as the Culton Tongs, the Suiciders, the Governs, the Rushall Boys, and the Baltic Fleet. The Bridgeton Billy Boys were the largest gang in British history. At their peak in the late 1920s, the Billy Boys numbered 800 members, making them larger than any gang London had ever seen. They were divided into sections 40 strong, each with its own leader. They in turn took their orders from Billy Fullerton, the gang's chief. The gang was named after King William of Orange, popularly known as King Billy. The gang often clashed with Roman Catholic gangs, such as the Norman Conks and the Calton Tongs. The Billy Boys recruited Protestant youths from across Bridgeton and surrounding districts in Glasgow's East End. Most joined in their late teens. Many stayed active in the gang into their 20s and 30s. Billy Fullerton was a street-fighting man. On leaving school, he found work in a shipyard. However, in common with many young men of his generation, he experienced repeated bouts of unemployment in his teens. Local legend has it that Fullerton was attacked and badly beaten by a rival Catholic gang after beating them at football, and founded the Billy Boys to counter them. Whatever the truth, the Catholics who made up a large percentage of the population of Bridgeton in Glasgow's East End were not prepared to sit back and play the passive victim. Fullerton gained a following and became adept at marshalling the Billy Boys in activities such as church parades and religious processions, using them as an opportunity to march his gang through what were identified as Catholic thoroughfares. The Billy Boys adopted a militaristic style of behavior, marching on parades, forming their own bands, composing their own songs and music, and all dressed in a similar manner. The Billy Boys also formed a junior group whose members were teenagers called the Derry Boys. Fullerton was a member of the British Fascists. He was awarded a medal for strike-breaking during the 1926 general strike. He also played the newspapers and was fond of giving interviews that portrayed himself as a local celebrity, someone who had left behind the world of the gangs and gone straight. But this was a lie. Fullerton himself was arrested when he led a gang of drunken, tooled-up Billy Boys through Glasgow. He had foolishly brought a child along, and the gang were intercepted by a smaller but determined group of policemen who arrested him after a brutal struggle. He was sent to prison for 10 months for being drunk in charge of a child. Glasgow gangs were divided between those that were solely territorial and those that combined territorial and sectarian allegiances, such as the Protestant Bridgeton Billy Boys, who frequently clashed with the Roman Catholic Norman Conks in the East End of the city. The Billy Boys would meet at Bridgeton Cross, their claimed territory. The Norman Conks would gather in a street that was roughly half a kilometre south. The fact that the two were so close, geographically, caused many fights. The Eastern Standard newspaper in 1930 described one local rivalry, and it's a good example of how the gangs were viewed by the press. The Bluebell was a well-known organisation with adherents in Calton and Bridgeton. The gang was particularly notorious as dance hall disturbers. One dance hall in Bridgeton in particular suffered from its activities and was the scene of not a few battles royal. The Bluebell had a grievance, real or imaginary, with Rutherglen prototype the Castle Bank, and had several stand-up fights with this rival. Not a few solo fights were settled on Sunday mornings between individual members of these gangs. At some point, the gangs became overtly criminal. While the open razor was still the main weapon of choice, koshers and wooden staves were also used. Having staked out their territories, gangs began to become protection rackets, and some amassed small fortunes from campaigns of intimidation against local businesses. Glasgow police once confiscated £500 from the account of one gang leader, an enormous sum in the 1930s. The image of Robin Hood-type figures protecting their area, or co-religionists, is simply untrue. These were criminal enterprises built on violence and intimidation. In the 1920s, Glasgow became known for its gang violence, particularly in the Gorbals area, leading to the portrayal of Glasgow as one of Britain's most violent cities. Relations between the gangs and the police were violent on both sides, as police officers and local youths contested ownership of the streets. Throughout the 1930s, the police in Glasgow maintained a network of paid informers, including bar staff employed in public houses in the poorer districts of the South Side and the East End, in order to gather information concerning the planned activities of local street gangs. Confrontations between gangs and police officers frequently followed police attempts to take gang members into custody. For example, in July 1939, a major disturbance erupted in the Gorbals as the Beehive Boys and the South Side Stickers reportedly joined forces to confront police officers who were taking 2 prisoners to the police station. Hundreds of local people gathered at the main street corners, and police reinforcements were stoned as they arrived in Thistle Street in squad cars and vans. As the disturbance spread, shop windows were smashed, and police officers were forced to stand guard to prevent looting. It was the police who had to face up to the gangs, and one chief constable in particular confronted the gang menace head-on. Percy Joseph Sillitoe was appointed Chief Constable of Glasgow on December 22, 1931, from Sheffield City Police, where he had also been Chief Constable. He immediately set about reorganizing the force and reducing the number of divisions from 11 to 7. He set up the Identification Bureau, introduced wireless into police cars, and is credited with inventing the Sillitoe tartan, the black and white checkered cap band. He also successfully oversaw operations to beat the infamous Glasgow gangs of the 1930s. Sillitoe had gained valuable experience in dealing with a number of street gangs in Sheffield, utilizing teams of police officers and enlisting the support of the council and magistracy. Within 3 weeks of his appointment in Glasgow, he addressed a meeting of 1,500 Glasgow police officers in the City Hall. His most controversial instruction was that 35 long-serving and high-ranking officers should retire to make way for younger men. Percy Sillitoe is perhaps remembered for his endeavours to deal with gang violence and protection rackets in Glasgow. Using the experience he gained in Sheffield with a similar problem, he enlisted the support of the Glasgow Corporation, the magistrates, and the Procurator Fiscal. This, coupled with his support for his officers in dealing with large street fights, and the use of the mounted branch, nicknamed Sillitoe's Cossacks, led to the breakup of the organized gangs and the imprisonment of many of their leaders. His tactic was to recruit big, strong men from rural areas and the Scottish Highlands. These were men who had no connection to Glasgow's sectarian divides, no loyalty to local neighborhoods, and no fear of the razor gangs who had terrorized the city for years. Sillitoe flooded gang territories with police. He ensured gang members received maximum prison sentences. He confiscated £600 from Billy Fullerton's bank account, a devastating financial blow. His ruthless tactics weakened both gangs, but couldn't completely break them. In the early 1930s, gang numbers started to decrease. mainly due to the work of Percy Sillitoe. Due also to the start of World War II, the Billy Boys went into decline in the late 1930s. What finally ended the 20-year sectarian war was World War II. Thousands of Billy Boys and Norman Conks members enlisted or were conscripted into the military. Men who had slashed each other with razors on Glasgow's streets were now fighting side by side against Nazi Germany. The war gave them purpose, employment, and a reason to abandon gang life. Glasgow's tough image was sealed when No Mean City was published in October 1935. Written by the journalist H. Kingsley Long from material provided by an alcoholic baker, Alexander MacArthur, the book was an instant success and has never been out of print since, a fact that still rankles with the city fathers and mothers. No Mean City, the title taken from the biblical description of Tarsus by St. Paul, tells the story of Johnny Stark, the Razor King, and his rise to become leader of his gang in a slum area like the Gorbals. Told in uncompromising tones, it still has the power to shock. The Evening Times wrote that No Mean City had branded the city a collection of thugs and harlots, and was the worst possible advertisement Glasgow can have when the city is striving to live down its evil and undeserved reputation. The Evening Times added that one cannot quite swallow all the ferocity and venomous hatred, the idolatry of the Razor King, the lust, and the entire absence of any code of moral behavior. But the reality was close enough to the fiction. It was an unfair image, foisted upon the city largely through alarmist press reports and rumor-mongering. Yet at the time, and especially after the book No Mean City was published in 1935, Glasgow did indeed have the reputation of having a serious violence problem caused by gangs which flourished in some of the poorer, slum-ridden parts of the city. If truth be told, the No Mean City image was at least partially deserved. As World War II approached, Billy Fullerton found common cause with Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists. He formed a Glasgow branch of the British Union of Fascists with the onset of World War II. He soon had a 200-strong group of blackshirts under his command. It is said he also started the first Glasgow chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. There wasn't much to like about the guy. Fullerton died in 1962 at the age of 56. In the late 1960s, a moral panic swept Glasgow, with media and police attention focused on new youth gangs that were younger, more violent, and more dangerous than the Glasgow razor gangs of the 1920s and 1930s. By the turn of the 21st century, Glasgow had the highest number of street gangs in the UK. In 2006, there were as many young teams in Greater Glasgow as in London, the UK capital, which is geographically 6 times as large. The numbers of young people involved in gangs and the violence inflicted in statistical terms reduced significantly over the next decade, due to various factors, including successful initiatives to engage with gang members by organizations such as the Violence Reduction Unit. However, organized crime groups remained a significant problem in the city. The story of the Glasgow razor gangs matters because it shows how unemployment, sectarian hatred, and lack of opportunity created a culture where violence became normalized. The gangs emerged from specific conditions: poverty, religious division, mass unemployment, and communities where territorial control was the only power young men could exercise. They fought over streets because streets were all they had. They slashed faces because the Glasgow Smile was a permanent mark of victory, a scar that announced to everyone who saw it that the victim had lost. And they built their identities around their gangs because their gangs were the only institutions that valued them. Percy Sillitoe's campaign proved that strong policing could weaken gangs, But it took World War II to finally break them. The war offered what Glasgow's slums never could: purpose, employment, and a future worth choosing over the razor. When Billy Boys and Norman Conks members came home from the war, many had seen enough violence. They'd fought real enemies in real wars, and the sectarian hatred that had consumed Glasgow for 2 decades seemed petty by comparison. The Glasgow razor gangs are gone, their weapons now museum pieces, Billy Fullerton dead, and his 800-strong army scattered. But their legacy survives in every city where unemployment, religious division, and lack of opportunity create conditions for gang culture to flourish. Different weapons, different territories, same fundamental logic. When society offers young people nothing, they create their own cultures, their own rules, and their own ways of mattering. This is just one chapter in Britain's hidden underworld history. If you want more stories like this, from medieval outlaw armies to Manchester's scuttlers, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which gang story you want next. This is Clyde Crooks. See you in the next war.